This is the Board Natural and Cultural Resources Committee meeting of the East Bay Regional Park District on September 9th, beginning at 12:31 p.m. Committee Chair Lane, would you like me to do a roll call?
Yes, please.
Right. Board members include Committee Chair Lane.
Here.
Director Coffey.
Present.
Director Eccles. Assistant General Manager Kelchner.
Present.
And additional staff on the call today include Chief of Stewardship Matt Grohl, Biologist 2 David Renchi, Vegetation Ecologist 2 Kimberly Crispin, Ecologist 2 Kristen Van Dam, Archives Program Supervisor Brenda Montano, and Chief of Operations Steve Castile. I believe that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think our Chief of Planning, Brian Holt, just joined us too. So.
Got it. Chair Lane, we're ready to start the meeting.
Okay, thank you. I want to be sure Elizabeth is here. Are you? Oh, there you are. Hi, Elizabeth. Okay, so today's board meeting is held in accordance with Governor Newsom's executive order, allowing for board members to participate in standing committee meetings remotely. We're also providing live audio. What are we doing here? The screen is, I'm seeing only Yoko's name on the screen.
My screen looks normal, Beverly. I think we're okay.
Okay, so I can see you. All right. Okay, we're also providing live audio and video streaming, and have provided the public with the opportunity to email or call in prior to the meeting for public comment. All information regarding participation in this meeting can be found on the agenda on the district website, ebparks.org. After each presentation, we'll be taking public comments through the Zoom platform. So if a member of the public would like to speak on an item on the agenda, raise your hand and the committee secretary will record your information and you will be recognized to speak during the comment period for that item. And we're going to have a comment period after each item. So do any of the committee members have any questions about meeting procedures? Okay, so we'll start our agenda. And our first agenda item is California red-legged frog response to the pond restorations in Guerin, presented by wildlife biologist 2 Dave Renchi. Dave?
Well, it's an honor to be here today, and it's a great opportunity to talk about something that I'm really happy about. And I'm going to try to share my screen now and begin a wonderful presentation for all of you.
Okay, I'm looking forward to it. I'm going to turn off my screen, but I will be listening.
All right, I hope you folks can all see my screen from the beginning here. It's an exciting opportunity to talk about a species that's very special and near and dear to my heart, and hopefully by the end of the day, it'll be near and dear to your heart. So I always want to begin these talks with first the backbone of our wildlife department, which is our volunteer program. This particular is the Amphibian Ambassadors. More than 16,000 people have participated in this project over the last 2 decades and over 100,000 hours of volunteer service. Also, our great work hinges on partnerships with other groups. And as you can see here, I'm not going to take the time to go through this, but there are 6 different institutions that have played a key role in the innovative work I'm going to share with you today as far as funding and support. So what are the key messages I want to get across today? My hope is to share with you the importance and the physical descriptions of what a California red-legged frog looks like, some of its conservation status. And then I want to talk a little bit about some of our local research and regional research on this animal. talk briefly about the survey techniques and statistics. I don't want to bore you with the details on that, but spend more time talking about the conclusions and next steps for our efforts. So basically, we have a beautiful frog here. I hope you can see this frog. It's one of our largest, it's our largest native frog. It's relatively brown. It has, I hope you can see my pointer by the frog's eye. And we have this beautiful dorsolateral line that runs down the animal's back. It's particularly known for its color, named for its ventral surface, its belly, which has reddish legs, going to run all the way up into the stomach area. Any questions on physical description of the frog?
Well, he looked more attractive than I've seen him before.
Thank you. They're very attractive. So once again, the prominent fold. So a little bit about the natural history. This animal inhabits permanent and seasonal water sources. Those can be streams, those can be wetlands, those can be ephemeral pools at an elevation below 15,000 feet. And here we have a wonderful pond in our own backyard. And you can see it's a beautiful water area. We've got a nice vegetated shoreline, and they do make use of the upland habitat, although we call it terrestrial habitat. This is the area where the grasslands, where the gophers and the ground squirrels are, where the red-legged frogs, when this pond dries up, retreat to spend the summer. So breeding adult California red-legged frogs, CRLF stands for California red-legged frogs, and they use a variety of aquatic habitats. These can be deep pools, these can be streams, these can be creeks and marshes and lagoons. Here we have an adult preparing to do reproduction. You can see the dark lateral fold on it. And here's a pond, which is going to be sort of our topic of the day. Livestock ponds serve as breeding sites, and when they provide the proper hydro period, and when I say hydro period, I'm talking about the amount of time that pond is going to hold water. Is it going to hold the water from, say, January through the end of July, or is it going to be short and be January through May? And of course, we have to have the right amount of vegetation. You can see here we've got a nice vegetated shoreline. So egg masses, these animals lay their eggs in the water. They need water to survive. Amphibian means two lives, life on land, life on water. And here you have, if you could take your fist or take two of your fists and put it together, that's about the size of a California red-legged frog egg mass. And there are hundreds of larvae in there. And they lay them on vegetation, and then they start to sink below the surface. And I share that now when I talk about the survey techniques. We have to look at them, look for them every 2 weeks. And of course, larvae, not to go into the whole natural history, I hope you can see my pointer, eggs have to hatch. And then within 3.5 months to 7 months, these tadpoles have to sprout legs and leap out of the water, eat bugs, eat anything that bugs them, and then find some sort of retreat in a woodland environment or in a ground squirrel hole to spend their summer. So 3.5 months to 7 months to metamorphose. So what's the status of this frog? This is our largest native frog in California, once abundant throughout much of the state. It's now considered a threatened species. And there's actually two types of red-legged frogs. I hope you can see my screen here. We have the northern red-legged frog up in Mendocino and Humboldt County. And then the orange, as you can see here, this is the home of the topic of today's discussion, the California red-legged frog. And they've disappeared over 70% of their habitat. And there's a whole host of reasons for their decline. Certainly habitat loss, fragmentation, meaning chunks of habitat being broken apart, animals not being able to move from pond to pond. And of course, the introduction of the invasive eastern bullfrog or American bullfrog. So just a little bit about the beautiful parks we have. I do want to say that we have over 12 different types of amphibians. So we have different types of frogs and salamanders that live in the park district, and over 30 different types of reptiles like this turtle. So most notably, there's the park district provides habitat that meets the life history needs and requirements for 6. And I have here in the top screen, of course, our friend, the California red-legged frog, our California tiger salamander, and certainly something that I'd like to stick my neck out for, the western pond turtle as well. That was meant to be a joke. Okay. All right, so just briefly on our local research, if we want to know about the distribution of tiger salamanders, red-legged frogs, or foothill yellow-legged frogs, we'd go to one of our documents put together by Steve Bobzine and Jody Donato, and we're building on that work when we're talking about pond restoration. If we want to talk about habitat use and overwintering and nest site selection, then we've got work that I've done on the pond turtle to help guide our management decisions. So what are other folks doing looking at California red-legged frogs? Well, presentation a little more than a year and a half ago by East Bay Municipal Utility District talked about their pond restoration efforts, and they showed that a majority of their restoration sites, greater than 60% of those ponds that were restored, either maintained red-legged frogs. And then I'm not going to go into the modeling that Mid-Peninsula did, but simply to say they were looking at long-term trends and showed a slight increase and recovery of red-legged frogs following the drought. So we've got 2 neighboring agencies seeing what they're doing and help to guide our work. So now I want to talk a little bit about Guerin Park, but I'm going to need to get a sip of coffee here. So Guerin Park, particularly the Newt Pond Wildlife Area, located in Hayward, is the location for this study. It's situated in a grassland environment. I hope you can see my pointer, and of course the pond here. And then we've got oak woodlands and bay trees and a nice riparian habitat. And it's important. It was named for the over 1,600 California newts that would migrate to this pond in a study done in 1969. So quite a regional treasure that we have in the park district, where California newts were monitored to see just how far they would go. But this is also the site of our site for the pond restoration. And you can see here in the lower portion of the right-hand corner, this is the closest pond where frogs could have immigrated to lay eggs. And that's going to be important when I get to the discussion of data. So the pond is in a critical area for California red-legged frog. The pond was choked 100% cattails and was not supporting or holding water through the typical breeding season, which would need to extend into July. It was starting to dry by the end of May, mid-July, and supported few adults. So I'll just rip through these survey methods. We looked at all life history stages from 2008 to 2020. So this is kind of neat when you have 12 years of data to go through to look at protocol level studies using a variety of dip nets, catching frogs, and such. And we did daytime surveys to look for egg masses. All right, so all life histories were looked at. Particularly, we were looking for larvae, and those were the tadpoles that I showed you earlier. And we did 10 samples, 1.5 meters, which is 5 feet, to keep it consistent between locations. And the paper that was provided goes into greater detail on that, and I'll just leave that for your reading pleasure. What I do want to mention is some of the recovery criteria and why the park district is moving in this direction. We want to provide suitable habitat for the management in the core areas. And we want to look at populations over a 15-year period. And I want to skip down to number 4. We want to look at where we can reestablish California red-legged frog populations within their historic range, and then create a way where red-legged frogs can recolonize. There's connections, places for them to move. If you think back to that one picture I showed you where the closest pond was. Okay, so permitting is quite lengthy these days. It also requires a lot of skilled, and this is where our colleagues in roads and trails come into play. We actually use our own crews to do this pond restoration. They're people I can trust. I can say, do this, and it happens. And there's good communication back and forth. But I also wanted to share with you, there's a lot of permits that goes into this kind of work. Fish and wildlife permits, Department of Fish and Game permits, water quality permits. There's over 8 different types of permits just to do this type of work. It takes like a year and a half, sometimes 2 years, just to go through the process of getting all the permits lined up to do this work. So it's challenging and it's expensive. So heavy equipment, we did the work in September of 2017. We removed over 260 cubic yards of material. Think about our 5-yard dump trucks, and we pulled out sediment and cattail using a long reach excavator that you can see in the lower left-hand side of your screen, a loader that would carry the material up to a dump truck, and then it would be dumped to spoils. And the whole goal here was to increase the depth and time that the pond was going to hold water. We wanted to make that pond hold between 3 and 5 feet of water from April through the end of May into June, with the hopes by July 1 that pond would start to dry up and the larvae would leave. Also, we removed over 80% of the vegetation. What I didn't say here is that the vegetation, too much vegetation, doesn't create the right conditions for water warmth and water depth for larva frogs to develop and hatch out. How am I doing for time here? I can't tell. 53. Okay, we'll go on. So we did protocol level surveys, and whenever we want to look at work that we do for restoration, we want to see how well did the species actually respond to the attempt. So we compared reproductive output, that means the number of egg masses and larvae that we found, those tadpoles, prior to restoration, and then following it and using a 2-sample t-test. So we want to apply statistics to our work, just not a bar-shaped graph, and then following. So here you can see the screen, and you can see from 2008, there was times through 2016 where we never found an egg mass. I never found an egg mass. I never saw larva frogs. I might find a few adults. And then in 2017, you may recall, we had 150% of rainfall. So that gave us the evidence. If I could increase that hydro period, the time that pond could hold water, that pond could be restored to red-legged frogs. So the work happened in 2007, the fall. And following the work, you can see each year following, we had over 8 California red-legged egg masses and quite a large number of larvae. And the nice thing about this is, I'll just go down here to the bottom here. It was a significant increase in the number at the 0.001 level, which is like a great statistical work for field work. So what does this all mean? Pond restoration mean? Well, when we can remove a lot of vegetation that slows down the reproductive rate, we can improve the pond. So sediment, by removing the sediment, we make the pond deeper. We get the pond down to 1.5 meters, or shall we say 3 to 5 feet in depth. The pond's going to hold water through the end of July 31st, when the frogs would leave. So that helps the frogs. Okay. So we know that this work will benefit the frogs over time, because the larvae that develop there, that hatch out in 3.5 to 7 months and reach sexual maturity in 3 years, were likely to come back to this location. And other studies have shown that if the larvae develop in a spot over 2 seasons, they're not going to really go anywhere. Okay, so summary here today. We restored a pond, and by removing sediment, and cattails. We increased the depth of the pond to 5 feet and the length of time the pond's going to hold water till early summer, July 31st. And what do we get? We got a resounding result. The number of egg masses, number of adults 3 years following it increased. So this type of strategy may benefit these threatened species at similar sites where the ponds are too shallow or they're choked with vegetation. And we have a peer-reviewed paper that was submitted, and got my colleagues or folks around to criticize or support the work on that. So what are the next steps? Well, the next steps are to continue monitoring GNPWA, that's the Garrett Pond Wildlife Area long-term. Also, want to start expanding our restoration work to Garin and Pleasanton Ridge and of course Clayton Ranch. And then conducting bat monitoring. I know I'm just kind of throwing this in there, but we spent a lot of time looking at one group of animals that eat bugs, and certainly bats eat bugs too. And it's quite phenomenal what kind of flying mammals come out at night over a pond that actually has water that's producing red-legged frogs versus one that's not. And that's something, sort of a teaser, a few years to come, next talk. All right, we always want to share what we do with others, involve as many people as we can in our work, people of all ages, because the parks are all of ours to take care of, and we want to have fun and involvement in the parks. And here's where I want to say, we hold the future of the California red-legged frog in our hands with the actions that we take. And there's a paper, and now I'm open to questions.
Okay, thank you very much, David. First I'll turn to the committee members. Colin or Elizabeth, do you have any questions for him?
I don't have any questions, but thank you for the presentation. This is wonderful. It's wonderful news. I really appreciate all the data, and I'm also very impressed with the number of volunteers that you had participating. I think that's just fabulous.
Thank you.
I think so too. Okay, Colin?
Yeah, I wanted to add to that, just congratulate David and his associates for the publication. I got a chance to basically glance through it, and it was quite professional, quite academic, and very impressive. And I think just speaks very well of the district and our the resources we're willing to devote to this endeavor, and the priority that we make it is just something that I appreciate, and a lot of our colleagues in open space and habitat conservation, I'm sure, appreciate. But I just especially wanted to congratulate David on the successful publication here and all that entails.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Colin. I have my usual question, which is, I think inside the regional parks, we have quite a few red-legged frogs. Is that correct? I'm not going to ask you how many, but.
Matt, do you want me to answer that?
Yeah, sure, Dave. Yeah, you can answer.
Yeah, we have a little over 300 ponds in the park district, and our red-legged frog population is doing quite well. And it's thanks to the efforts that the district puts towards that type of conservation and management effort. So.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to put it in context that before development, urban development around the bay and a lot of areas, there were a lot more willow swamps and areas of just marshlands that had a lot of wetlands that supported a lot of these red-legged frogs. And now most of them had to move into the uplands because a lot of our stream systems and wetlands have been impacted. So the district really manages and maintains a lot of the last reserves of these species. So they do very well in our pond systems and in many of our streams. But just have to have the right conditions. Some of our streams are too cold and too shaded, and others have nice open areas for amphibians. So we have great habitat throughout the park district.
Okay, and because they've essentially lost their habitat elsewhere, that's why they're endangered,
Yes, yeah,
right?
throughout this region, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because, they're not endangered inside the parks.
Right. I mean, I think that's the thing. You go to some of our ponds at the right time of the year, and you may see hundreds or thousands. So locally, that's why the parks are so important for that genetic diversity and that biological reserve for other areas. And we do see, just as Dave talked about, once we reestablish these ponds or restore them, they can move miles to recolonize other ponds. And so that's why we're starting to really look at these things as a whole system and looking at ways to expand the populations within the park district also.
So in looking at Garin, that's why the second pond is important to have, because they
Yeah.
can do that.
Right. Yes. Yeah. The adjacent ponds can often be the source, or yeah. I mean, but it works both ways. I mean, if that adjacent ponds get colonized with bullfrogs, then they can then make their way to these other ponds. So we have to kind of manage, the invasive species, but then also, try to enhance habitat for the native species.
Yeah, so after you cleaned out this particular pond in Garin, did you need to populate it with red-legged frogs, or did they find it on their own?
So I'll take that one.
Yeah.
So that adjacent pond, I believe, I can't prove that because we didn't put telemetry on those frogs, but in the past at Garin, I'd only find like 1 or 2 adults and I'd find no larvae. And immediately the next year after restoration, we had 8 egg masses for 2 years in a row. So that would imply only one female is going to lay 1 egg mass, that we had to have at least 8 to 10 females coming from that adjacent pond to come to the Garin pond. So, that's a great question because that got asked of me at the Wildlife Society. Where do I think these frogs came from? And it came from an adjacent pond. But future evidence and work on putting telemetry on some of these frogs, as Matt mentioned, if we start looking at whole systems, maybe at Pleasanton Ridge or other locations, we'll start to see that dispersal go out. And I did want to mention that this is the first publication of its kind where an agency actually followed up on a restoration of a pond and showed the increase of population. So that was it's a real feather in our cap.
All right, congratulations on that. Then I have a question about Jewel Lake. Were there ever red-legged frogs there?
I would say likely there were at one point. Yeah, I mean, in that watershed, but we don't see them very much at all in the Wildcat Creek watershed. There's even other parts of outside of Jewel Lake within Wildcat Creek. We don't have, they're more intermittent occurrences. We don't have breeding populations present that we observe on a regular basis. So just very occasionally, I think the last one we saw was in the stream about 10 to 15 years ago. In one part of the stream, we documented one there, but there's not a regular population. We recently did a bunch of surveys of the Jewel Lake area and the wetlands to inform future fuel management activities, and we didn't find any. They're very intermittent, but that's one of the hopes with the restoring of the ponds adjacent to Jewel Lake. Once we get that hydro period right, that we may see them breed there more regularly, because we have seen them show up in those interpretive ponds on a limited basis, but that we haven't seen successful breeding. So we're hoping with the restoration we did about 2 years ago now, and we've had one good year of a good hydro period, that over time we'll get another one, get more breeding happening in those areas. But we'll see.
Okay, but we don't move red-legged frogs.
No, it's very complicated. There's a lot of regulations involved, and it's often not successful when you try to move them. It's something we just aren't exploring right now because of the regulatory constraints and also the risk of just doing harm. And I think it has been tried years in the past, more with tiger salamanders, and it was unsuccessful. So I think that's something we're just all cautious about because they're already in peril. We don't want to put them at risk by trying to do that.
Okay.
Yeah, but in an extreme situation, it's something we consider, but there's just a lot of risks and regulations, additional regulations besides the permitting on top of that. I believe we did have one comment or question from the public. That's Amelia's got her camera on now, so unmute Amelia.
Hi there. Yes, Director Lane and Matt have anticipated part of my questions. And by the way, Dr. Rinchi, congratulations. Everybody needs to feel good this week, and this is something we can feel good about. But I was wondering about Lake Temescal. There was some talk about dredging sediment out of Lake Temescal, and is there any feasibility of the upstream part of Lake Temescal becoming red-legged frog habitat sometime in the future? Thank you.
I'm not sure about that. I mean, that's one area we haven't seen them in the Temescal area. So I think it'd be challenging because I don't know of a natural population that still exists. Dave, do you know anything about the Temescal watershed?
You know, just my sort of off the cuff thing. I'm not really familiar with any red-legged frogs in that watershed. One thing I did neglect to say in this presentation, I mentioned the American bullfrog, but I didn't really go into the breeding strategy in that the American bullfrog needs a permanent year-round water source for 2 years, whereas a red-legged frog needs 7 months, 8 months. So a permanent water source would be advantageous for the invasion of the American bullfrog, which we see in other locations. And then when we've done stomach analysis, we found them full of red-legged frogs and turtles and other things. So to really benefit the California red-legged frog, we want to have the ideal hydro period of a seasonal pond, seasonal marsh. That will allow the red-legged frogs to flourish, but it doesn't provide the opportunity for its invasive species to colonize. I hope that I answered that for you okay, Amelia?
Yes,
Yeah,
that's fascinating. And I guess we won't look for them in Lake Temescal, but we'll look for them in all those great stock ponds. For those of us who like cattle, it's one more reason to have grazing animals in stock ponds. Thank you.
yeah, thank you, Amelia. I think, you know, probably a large percentage of those ponds are stock ponds in grazing. And isn't that correct, David?
Yeah, a large number of those stock ponds are very advantageous for the red-legged frog because they've got the right upland environment for them to retreat into the ground squirrel burrows. And then the other aspect of the stock ponds is their ideal breeding habitat for the California tiger salamander. And some of those stock ponds, we have turtles, so you get 3 special status amphibians and reptiles in one spot. It's sort of like the treasure trove of wildlife in some of those stock ponds.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at them, because often before I was hearing any of this information, I used to think those ponds were kind of unappealing, but now they're just full of interesting wildlife. So
They're hopping with California red-legged frogs, pardon the pun.
Yeah, and I think it's also important for I mean, we often don't see a lot in congregating because they're moving through, but even migratory birds and other, birds that move through the area use those ponds for a little rest, to get a little food, get some water, and then move on to the next place. So I think it's also important. It's just important for a host of species. We focus on the amphibians a lot, but they're just very important on the landscape.
well, I know my other question had to do with the bats and frogs, since they're all after bugs.
Right.
Is that a competition? I mean, can there be too many bats and frogs for the number of bugs, or?
That's a great question, Director Lane. One of the things I love about frogs and bats is they eat anything that bugs them, right?
Right.
Wish we could do the same. But the red-legged frogs are foraging on different types of insects. And the bats that are using our ponds, like the myotis and the pallid bat, they're foraging on large insects that come out after dark and moths. And recently, I don't want to go off on a tangent, but that Clayton pond, I had pallid bats, and they're going after large arthropods like scorpions. It was just so cool to get the signal of them and then get my flashlight and watch one duking it out with a scorpion. I wish I would have had like the camera, but so I guess to answer your question, the frogs and the bats are feeding on different types of insects that are using those ponds. So they're sharing the resource.
Okay.
You got the day shift and the night shift.
Thank you. All right, so is there anyone else in the public who wanted to comment on this item?
There are no comments.
No other ones? Okay. All right, thank you, Coca. And thank you very much, David, for this, for your presentation. Very interesting indeed. Then our second item is going a little more into the air, and that is monarchs in the East Bay parks, opportunities and challenges in a changing environment. So we have two of our ecologists who are going to speak on this, Kimberly Crispin and Kristen Von Dam, or just one of you?
Hi, both of us today.
Both of us.
All right, welcome.
Thank you very much. Matt, did you want to give us an introduction to this presentation?
Yeah, I will give an introduction. So this is something we've been working on for many years as far as monarch monitoring. In the district, we've got 2 overwintering populations, one at Point Pinole and then one at Ardenwood. And then we have other areas that support overwintering populations to the district. And then we're also looking in the future about what we can do to enhance breeding habitat. But really today, we're going to talk about some of the life history and things, the monitoring we've done, but then also Kristen is working with the fire department and operations on a project to thin eucalyptus at Point Pinole to enhance the habitat for monarchs. So we're going to talk a little bit about both aspects today. And Kimberly's got a lot of good experience because Kimberly used to work at Ardenwood, where they have got an active colony. But Kimberly, we're lucky to have her now in stewardship as one of our IPM staff, as a veg ecologist in the IPM department. So she's been a great addition to our team. And you all know Kristen from her great work in the fuels management program. So just happy to have them both present on this today.
Thank you. Just starting my screen share. Is that working in presentation mode for everyone?
Yeah. Yes.
Oops. There we go. Still learning this. All right. Thank you all for being here to join us with this presentation. Thank you, Matt, for the introduction. Again, I'm Kristen Van Dam. I'm the ecologist at stewardship. My main role is to assist the fire department in the implementation of our fuels management work. And I also get a chance to do cool projects like the one we'll be talking about a little later. Kim, can you give yourself a quick introduction?
Yeah, hi. I Kim Crispin. I was a gardener at Ardenwood for 2 years, and just recently at the beginning of Shelter in Place started as the veg ecologist in IPM, and feel very lucky to still be able to participate in various monarch projects while also working in fuel treatment areas in more of an IPM realm. Wonderful.
So first of all, I'm going to give you an introduction to monarchs and their life ecology and the threats to this population. They're one of our most iconic species here in California and at the Park District, and also one of our most threatened. There's been a 99% decline in the Western population in the past 30 years, 86% of which occurred from 2017 to 2018. Really, really dramatic and enough to trigger what we call an extinction vortex. This occurs when the population is low enough that a normal variation or disturbance can result in extinction. So very critical population issues for this butterfly. The threats to the species are many. They all appear in some way to be chronic and ongoing, and no single threat explains the recent crash. So there's a lot of mystery surrounding what's causing this, and therefore what the solutions might be to trying to save them. The life history of this species in the Western population ranges from Washington to Mexico. There are two disparate populations separated by the Rockies. The Western population overwinters on our coast here and breeds inland. These butterflies are milkweed specialists, and so the distribution of those specific Asclepias milkweed species is generally inland. And so that's where these butterflies go once they've finished overwintering. We host here the what we call the overwintering super generation, which lasts for 8 months, which is like 7 months longer than most of the other populations do, which is really interesting. And this population overwinters here on our coast with very, very specialized roosting preferences. So they really only occur in a few spots along our coastline.
So what do you mean by inland?
Inland is referring to anywhere east of the Coast Ranges and Diablo Range, Director Lane.
Okay.
So a lot of the Central Valley, for instance, and up through the inland Oregon and Washington as well.
Okay, thank you.
So our Western migration is, I think, one of the most fascinating examples of a migrating population of any animal, including insects. It takes them 4 to 5 generations to complete the migration. So no one butterfly is actually creating that whole migrational process. They do it in stages. And I was just talking about the super generation here plays a major part in the population overall living as long as they do. So mating occurs at the overwintering groves along our coastline before waking up in the spring and moving inland to lay their eggs on the milkweed. A brief overview of threats. Historically, loss and mismanagement of overwintering habitat. We did lose most of the Monterey pines that used to be the roosting habitat for the species when logging occurred in the early 1900s. The species then basically shifted to use the eucalyptus groves that had recently been planted as windbreaks. Very, very interesting plasticity pattern in that species to see that kind of a change. We've also had, of course, as we know, a vast amount of agricultural development on the inland sites, a lot of destruction of the milkweed, which has probably also had a big, big effect on the crashes of this population. Widespread use of agricultural insecticides has also been shown to play a role in the decline, although again, cannot be blamed for the majority of that decline. We really don't know what role it's played. As with almost all of our species here, climate change is impacting them most likely through extreme weather events, for instance, and changes in shifts in the seasons and temperatures. Disease and predation play a role as well. And there's some evidence that fire, the most recent introduction of large solar farms, and captive breeding and release for things like weddings and events interfere with the genetics of the butterfly as well. So there's a lot going on for them. The habitat loss that we're seeing is occurring throughout their range. So that's they're kind of being hammered throughout their entire migration. And their specialization on the milkweed what makes them vulnerable. So while they can, the adults can nectar on many different species of plants, they can only breed on milkweeds. That is the sole food source for the caterpillars. And so if they don't have milkweeds on which the caterpillars can feed, you will not see the population recovering in areas like that. As I was saying, that there was a shift of populations roosting in the Monterey pines over to the eucalyptus, as we know is a non-native species here, but appears to be now exclusively tied to the species future in the overwintering groves, as we've seen them specialize on these trees and in the groves. Kim, do you want to talk about land use?
Yes. So like Kristen said in the previous slide, we haven't been able to, thank you, tie the great decline in monarchs to one effect over another, but studies on doing sensitivity analyses on all of the studies that have been done on the Western monarchs suggest that the land use impacts have been had a greater effect on this decline. So that would be overwintering and breeding habitat loss due to, for example, housing developments along the coast and agriculture in the Central Valley. But this, I think, should give us a lot of hope, and as a park district, make us feel very empowered, because our parklands span a considerable portion of the monarch's migration between our coastal eucalyptus and pine groves to inland parks that host milkweed, have historically, and could even more in the future. So a lot for as far as land use and our ability to make dramatic, quick change to help this imperiled species, I think it means a lot, and it feels less lofty than reversing climate change in the time that the monarchs need it to happen.
Indeed.
Oh, and just to show an example of places in our parks are groves, and then this is near Diablo Foothills, and all of that green that you see in the foreground is Asclepias fascicularis, which is a native milkweed, and would be a prime breeding site in a shaded area like that for monarchs that have recently left overwintering sites along the coast. So our role in monarch conservation, maintenance of our overwintering sites, and then conservation and restoration of those breeding sites, and identifying where else they could be within our district. Then also expansion of nectar plantings, especially those that are timed well with the migration. So the picture on the right is goldenrod, which is a special plant native to our region that flowers late. So in September and October, when migrating monarchs are coming into our overwintering sites, and they're really tired and they need resources, and flowers can be hard to come by. Plants like this are really important to be planting. Then also public education and engagement, for example, what plants you can supply to give nectar resources to monarchs, and then about different threats to the monarchs and how we can, as a society, ameliorate them. Then finally, collaboration with other public agencies and nonprofit organizations. A lot of people are very interested in helping monarchs right now, and we're part of a regional monarch working group where different agencies get together to discuss efforts in areas that we can help, and then also overwintering site managers group, which is all up and down the coast of California. Different land managers get together and talk about problems they're facing, trends they're seeing, and try to problem solve together. So our overwintering sites, we technically have 4, although Oyster Bay and Coyote Hills have thus far had pretty low numbers and haven't had as much consistency in the monarch counts. So Point Pinole and Ardenwood are our main, most robust populations. This is data from the Western Monarch Thanksgiving Day count that's conducted by the Xerces Society and has been since 1997. I want to just point out that that blue line is the Western US total, and so can be measured on the right-hand y-axis, and then the Point Pinole and Ardenwood counts are on the left axis. I just wanted to kind of put them together so you can see that the trends that we're seeing in our parks are mimicking the trend that we're seeing in the Western population as a whole. And that it's been a significant decline since we started counting in '97, and in the last 2 years has been especially dramatic. And one thing to note also with these counts is that they've actually counted more sites with each year. So the it only adds to the severity of the decline.
And a brief overview of the overwintering habitat. It's actually a very specific set of circumstances that make overwintering habitat effective for monarchs. They have very specific characteristics to be favorable for roosting. That is the substrate, which is the exact, you know, as in the photo, the leaves and the surrounding structure that the monarchs roost on. Exposure to solar radiation, which is very important for keeping their body temperatures up during the chilly winters while they're overwintering, and then protection from the wind, and that's associated with the large groves. Of course, these eucalyptus groves were planted as windbreaks, and they function very well as such. And that happens to be the three most important characteristics that monarchs need for successful overwintering sites. And we're going to go over our 4 overwintering sites in greater detail: Ardenwood, Point Pinole, Coyote Hills, and Oyster Bay.
Ardenwood has historically had the most attention for overwintering monarchs. They have the largest population and a really great naturalist staff that has promoted public engagement in counting the monarchs and creating a lot of enthusiasm about them there. So in 2017, we had an overwintering grove analysis done by Creekside Science. We had a lot of loss due to drought. And so Stu from Creekside Science came in to coach the staff on how to maintain the historic overwintering site. Then in 2018, we replaced a large patch and patches around the park of non-native milkweed with nectar plants. And Ardenwood is unique from other parks in that it has a lot of ornamental species. So we kind of just threw the kitchen sink at it and planted a bunch of different species so that we could make sure that there was going to be a lot of nectar resources when the monarchs needed them. Then in 2019, we planted 60 eucalyptus trees and also a toyon and oak windbreak. This was as was recommended by the overwintering grove analysis. So putting them in where it would create the most shelter for the monarchs, because the management plan had said that because of the loss of trees, our risk was more so from the impacts of wind than from anything else. So really, we're just trying to plant more trees every year there. And
I
then
remember those discussions because in general, people were talking in negative ways about eucalyptus. And then to discuss planting them at Ardenwood was an unusual conversation that year.
yes, I could talk forever about that. But it definitely, given their growth rate and their stature and just the historic nature of Ardenwood, made sense at the time, I hope. And then finally, public and school programming. So with the removal of the non-native milkweed at Ardenwood, we had to have a shift in our rhetoric because people weren't, it took away from the caterpillars that you could find at the park at any given time, but it gave us an opportunity to really talk about the importance of pollinator plants and also of, if you're going to plant milkweed, plant a native milkweed, and talk about why that is so important.
Similarly at Point Pinole, we're going to be doing some similar work. The operations staff there have been working on a pollinator garden for their whole host of pollinators, not only for monarchs, for a couple years now. We've received a grant this year from the Wildlife Conservation Board to enhance the overwintering groves using gap creation. So basically removing some trees to increase the solar exposure and the wind attenuation of that grove. So we'll be doing that hopefully in a couple months in the main grove. We've also been doing imaging and hemispherical photography. This is a photo here of our drone performing imaging at Point Pinole. again, done by Creekside Science, to give us a better idea of what the structure of these groves are and allow us to do the correct amount of gap creation. And that's going to be attached to 2 years of monitoring and more work on the pollinator garden to see if there's any effect of this work on our populations locally at Point Pinole.
So Coyote Hills and Oyster Bay are the overwintering populations that are still pretty small, but show a lot of promise and are also nearby to larger populations that could help feed into the overwintering site if we are to promote the right conditions. So a new grant in partnership with Resource Conservation District, we're bringing in Creekside Science to do his same analysis and provide us with management plans. And then also we'll be adding a total of 1 acre between the two parks of nectar resources. And Oyster Bay especially is a very exciting overwintering site. It's the only one that I am aware of where the monarchs are overwintering on native Torrey pines. All of our other overwintering sites are exclusively eucalyptus. And then our breeding habitat enhancement, where we are working more inland and sourcing seed from local milkweed populations. That would be Asclepias californica and Asclepias fascicularis, and then propagating them at Watershed Nursery to be planted at inland parks. For now, plans are for Diablo Foothills and Black Diamond Mines. And yeah. So for next steps, building upon these current projects, the expanding upon these breeding, overwintering, and nectaring sites. For example, spreading, doing more breeding site enhancement, maybe Morgan territory, where we know that there were historic large populations of milkweed. And then also monitoring the efficacy of our overwintering grove enhancement and following the site plans. In these plans, there are recommendations that have to be carried out over a number of years. And so that'll be a long-term endeavor. And then finally, employing community science to document monarch activity in parks. There are a lot of avenues for this already. The picture on the right is from Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper and shows wherever people see milkweed or monarchs or breeding monarchs. Also CalFlora and iNaturalist, and then there's our Seas Western Monarch Count. But we have a really valuable resource in all of our enthusiastic visitors, and it would be awesome to get a way to get their observations and find out in real time where monarchs are seen in the park and where they are going, and help us to focus our future restoration efforts. So thank you to all of our partners and many more, but funding sources and people who are helping us make these, focus our efforts and with funding and science. So thank you. And with that, we can open it up for anyone that has questions.
All right. Does anybody on the committee to start have some comments or questions on our monarchs? Colin?
Yeah. You know, at times we have suggested that it might be a good idea for the park district to get into the fairly widespread distribution to our public of milkweed. And I'm just wondering, that's just been out there. We've never really, at least at the board level, discussed it. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the efficacy of that kind of program. Can I just go to a nursery and buy the proper kind of milkweed and necessarily on my own know where to plant it, for instance? I mean, you know, there obviously is a science to all of that. And I'm just wondering if it is something that we can actually engage our public in by growing or acquiring and distributing milkweed ourselves.
I think, Colin, that's a good question. I think I'll just start with it. And I think it's something we've wrestled with a little bit because I think it's this obvious thing that we go, oh, this is a great thing someone can do in their backyard. As we're looking at it more closely, I think we see it almost more as there's a region like along the coast of the district where we wouldn't want to, along the edge of the bay, I should say. But more inland, when you look at East County and in parts of, any Black Diamond, Round Valley, many other parks, Garin, there's a good opportunity inland in those areas for milkweed to be enhanced and expanded. And so I think that's what we're starting to look at. But I'm just wondering, as you're asking the question, maybe I'm thinking out loud, but we could almost put a map together of the regions and maybe distribute that. And then within the regions, talk about what's good to plant in the various regions. And then that would apply to the public too, of what would be good in the various regions of the Bay. And so I think that's something we could probably put together.
I think we've done something small in that regard, but not very much. Is that
Yeah,
right?
and we've done it at certain times at events. There have been an interest in giving plants out. So often what we've done is give out the nectar plants for people because we know nectar plants can be good anywhere. Generally, it's just the breeding habitat we want to try to keep away from the overwintering, just for the genetic benefits of the species.
Okay.
Okay, I think we should do that. Okay, Elizabeth?
Yeah, thank you. I had a question about the overwintering site. So, when you said it's mostly at Point Pinole and Ardenwood, but I'm just wondering if there's sort of smaller populations that are scattered in other parts of the park, or whether it's just largely those two. And part of why I'm wondering is because, as Director Lane referred to earlier, certainly the park district is pushing to get rid of the eucalyptus and to return as much native species as possible. And so I'm just wondering about the impact on the monarchs, or whether it really is just mostly limited to Ardenwood and Point Pinole.
So far, that's what we've really observed, and we've done a lot of surveys looking for them in that way. And what we see there is the more clustering. Often you'll see in these other parks, you'll be out there hiking, you'll see monarch butterflies flying through, and you see them in most all of our parks. But what you don't see is them clustering in these numbers of tens to hundreds of butterflies together, clustering in a grove of trees. And we have not seen that. Often it's probably too windy in a lot of our East Bay Hills. A lot of those areas, there's just going to be too much wind at certain times of the year. That's one thing we're trying to do at Point Pinole is when we do the thinning and modification to create more areas of shelter within the grove. So there's more areas within the area that they can rest and stay. And so that's just what we've seen the distribution more like along those coastal areas, but and they also have high site fidelity. So once they are, overwintering in a site and staying in a site, they will return to that same site. So since they've had a long history, at the two places we've discussed, I think that's one reason we see a lot of them there. And so I think, but we're just not aware of other sites like that right now.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I don't know if you had a chance to ever see them clustered at Ardenwood, but it was pretty extraordinary. The first time you went there, you were like, well, what is this? And then you realized they were all butterflies. Didn't look like
some great photos over the years. There's some great, and some of those are in the district lore you'll see around, in our various promotional materials every now and then. But they're just amazing to see them like that.
Well, but to have them disappear like that in such a short period.
Yeah, and many of the places around the state where even there are areas near Carmel and other places, Pacific Grove, where there's a lot of tourism around that. And in those areas, you used to see tens of thousands, and now they're seeing hundreds at times. So it's just very distressing.
Yeah, well, it seemed to me like it would make more sense if it were a decline that went over a period of years, but to have it drop like that,
right?
Very, very hard when everybody loves the monarchs.
Right, and it was interesting that graph. I found the graph when we were preparing the presentation that Kimberly had very interesting to show that what we're seeing, and I was very aware of what we had seen, and that 2015-16 drop started dropping locally in the park district, but to see how that matched up with the national trend, in some ways made me feel a little better. But just that it wasn't something we were doing hear necessarily. It seems like that's what's happening within the population. But it's also concerning because then it's much harder about what we can really do to make a difference. But I think we know where we've seen them. And so I think as much we can do to enhance those areas and try to make them more successful, we can then expand it in the other areas as we have success.
Matt, can I add something
Please.
to that? So, I mean, we've been seeing the decline, as you could see from 97, that there has been a steady decline. And then once we get to lower population numbers, they're more vulnerable to stochastic events and changes up from that. And so I think what we had seen in 2018 spring was right after the butterflies had left their overwintering sites before they were able to make it to their first breeding locations. There was some inclement weather that probably caused that decline. And I was feeling pretty bummed out about that. It was Stu from Creekside Science that really gave me a lot of hope. He said, you know, a monarch butterfly can lay up to 400 eggs. And so really when you look at it like that, you know, we just have to increase their viability a little bit to see a really large increase in the population. And since we have those breeding sites that are the first ones that they're going to hit after they leave the overwintering site, we have a lot of power to do that.
Thank you. Thanks for that comment. All right. Are there any, do we have any public members, Coca, who have indicated they'd like to comment on this item?
There's no public comment on this item.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Okay, then we will move to our third item on the agenda. And that is a presentation on the district-wide archives updates, needs, and existing conditions. And we are going to hear from Archives Program Supervisor Brenda Montano. Carol, are you going to start first?
Yes, thank you, President. Director Lane, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm Carol Johnson, the Assistant General Manager of Public Affairs. And I'd like to introduce Brenda again. She's newly promoted to the position of Archive Program Supervisor, a brand new position within the Park District, one that shows the importance of the role of archives and history to this agency. Today, the presentation will focus on exclusively the existing conditions that were studied over the period of about 18 months by some consultants that I believe we have with us today. Brenda will talk about that. And because it's such a meaty report, we will have to come back at other time to discuss more specifically regarding recommendations and financing, budget related opportunities that we can take to remedy some of the challenges that you're about to hear about. So with that, I'm going to ask Brenda to start the presentation, and then we'll take questions after. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, Brenda.
Hi, so I'm going to share the screen. Okay, I think we're in. Again, I just want to say I am very grateful and honored to be in this position. As some of you know, I've been involved with preserving the archives for quite some time and for many years. And that's also trying to develop our district's history, our agency's history. But I've never been able to do this in a full-time capacity. So I'm very excited for the work that's ahead of me. And I wanted to do a quick thank you to Jerry Kent and the volunteers at the archives. I couldn't have couldn't get this far without them and the countless hours that they've contributed, as well as the very talented contractors and interns that have also contributed to the archives. Also, the Public Affairs Department and their support and guidance through all of this, And the archives does need to thank considerably the years of passionate staff members, both former and current, who have extended themselves beyond their jobs to make sure these records stay alive. And of course, the general manager, the office of the general manager, and the board of directors, who have been extremely supportive in our historic legacy. And we've had some really great events. Again, as Carol mentioned, we'll be talking about the existing conditions, and as part of a report, a larger report for the district-wide needs assessment and recommendations for the preservation and safekeeping of our invaluable and irreplaceable historic records and artifacts. I also want to acknowledge Robin Chandler and Waverly Lowell, who are with us today on this call, this meeting from the ONDA group. They are also available to answer any questions after the slideshow. And so we contracted with them about 18 months ago through the support of the board of directors and the general manager to do this district-wide needs assessment. Robin and Waverly are both very experienced professionals in the archives world. Both are honorary fellows with the Society of American Archivists, and both have received California state awards for their work. Robin has had a 30-year career in leadership positions as an archivist and digital librarian, and Waverly has a 40-year career in history, archives, education, and she is also an author. And she was recently honored with a research fellowship in her name after retiring from the College of Environmental Design at UC Berkeley. So today's presentation is going to be fairly limited from the full report. We're just going to be talking mostly about existing conditions, and I thought that that storage issues are of a big concern right now because of the fire conditions out there and the worry about where these things are going to be safe. And also to, let's go to 3. Okay. So this is one of my favorite slides because I love that map to show where everything is at the district. These are archives, these are historic records, these are cultural resources, artifacts, and this shows where the most of the archives live. The red circles are usually the parks that have more historic significance to the district, as well as they might have larger collections that we know about. We did have a list, and that was put together by our former Cultural Services Coordinator, Bev Ortiz, in partnership with me and Kate Collins, who was the supervising naturalist at the time at Black Diamond Mines. A little bit of history is that the board of directors, probably about a couple years ago, offered to help fund certain aspects of the archives. And we got as far as doing a really great job of getting more fireproof cabinets into the field. But we really thought that a needs assessment or something where we did a survey of everything that was going on at the district, so we knew how to put our best foot forward for the future. We also not only interviewed I shouldn't say we, the ONDA group or the consultants, because they did all this work. They surveyed very many sites as well as our district headquarters. So any of the headquarter departments, such as the administrative departments that are at Peralta Oaks, were also interviewed. The map is also a great opportunity to show what the enormity of trying to manage all of the different archives and different levels of storage and what items are out there. So this is just a bit of a summary of some of the survey findings, and as well as some of the risks that are that do happen out for the park district. And one is the park resources have the greatest risk of loss at the time land is initially acquired. Cultural resources and our historic records are usually in jeopardy when files and storage areas are cleared out. That could happen from whether offices move or staff retire, and the new staff might not know what to do with those items. It also has to do with the consistency of staff getting trained in knowledge of records management and or collections management. Then the other two, the too many tractors metaphor is just a way to say that we need to look at our collections a little bit closely. What the consultants found out in the field were many tractors instead of just maybe one or two that could be a part of a display or an example, and that other of those cultural resources could be either deaccessioned or left out in the field to be displayed. And the siloed park structure has to do with the following slides mostly, and the different ways that the park staff and headquarters have done what they needed to do in their offices. So first we want to talk about storage in the field. There have been multiple ways that the staff have stored their archives and their historical records. Most of them and almost all of them are temporary structures. And these structures are usually in an outdoor environment without temperature control or any safety in response to fire, floods, or earthquakes. There are also areas, storage places that are not usually intended for storing archives. And within those storage areas, there's different ways that archives have been stored in, and this is what the consultants had found in these photos that they've taken across different parts of the district. So some have storage cabinets, some do not have storage cabinets, some, it just depends on the location and how much space that they have. And also, I do not want to make this sound as if the staff at those locations are not also very interested and care a lot about their historic records. It's just the capacity for handling these records are pretty limited. And these are just some other examples of how things are being housed. A significant one photo here shows Janet Gomes, who had recently retired from Anthony Chabot as the park supervisor. And now the new supervisor that's there, Sarah Miracle Kite, and the administrative staff there are working with me right now on getting some of these historical records that were being stored there. Janet did a really great job trying to keep these items safe. She kept them in the park office, and now because they want to make more space out there, there's an opportunity for us to get those archives. And part of it is just an interest of seeing how we can centralize some of our records. And a lot of these things also too is where the an archives program could help, and it going out in the field as well and helping everyone figure out maybe some better ways to store their materials. And here's another example that the consultants found out in the field were different ways that the collections were being exhibited and stored within the cabinets. Some were organized fairly well, but then there were some limitations in that they were not stored in appropriate archival sleeves, and even the storage containers may or may not be the best containers. There's also material mixed in with other records that might not be as historically important. And this is just another example too from two different parks, one from Ardenwood and Black Diamond Mines, and the different treatments that are given to the historical records and artifacts. And one thing the consultants observed and out in the field, the Black Diamond Mines collection that is out in Antioch at the park, at the visitor center, is in it's been there for quite some time, but it is a temporary trailer. And the photo shows in this example, there's the green hills and it's springtime, and it looks relatively safe, but it just takes a season or two and the conditions to look extremely different, and with the threat of fire in that area. And right now the trailer does not have any defensible, they do not have a defense against fire right now. And they have one of the most robust and most processed collection, thanks to Tracy Parent for many years, and her volunteers that work there, our volunteers now too. And just to juxtapose, I saw this picture today, and this is the Big Basin State Park headquarters building. And maybe some of you know of the historic records that were also being stored there in a park facility, and it is now gone. And coming to another collection, this is some photos I took at the Trudeau Archives. As you can see, we have many different storage areas in the building. We're limited. We only have the basement and half of the basement, and this is at the Trudeau Training Center that's at Reinhardt Redwood Regional Park. And within there, we try to store as much as we can of our very significantly historical records in these fireproof cabinets. I call the top photo the Manhattan Room. And in there are some of our prize collections, and a lot of it is chronological history from when the founding of the district happened. And then in the bottom left photo is actually the garage that's at Trudeau. And the consultants observed that in that garage, there is no security system in that garage. There's no alarm system that extends into there. The rest of the building does have it. There's only smoke detectors at Trudeau, and there are no other fire prevention measures other than fire extinguishers being posted in the building. There's a concern of fire there as well. The garage, if I could mention really quickly, a lot of it is our collections that were brought in from the field that our former cultural services coordinator, Bev Ortiz, had collected as we were acquiring park sites, or she found out about different historical sites or families that had collections that they wanted to give to the park district. And she was able to have really great interns come and curate and identify and at least keep them boxed up and stored somewhere. The consultants also looked at I didn't have another word to call it other than possibly procedures. And as the center image for our IT department or our IS department here at the Park District is how can we have a better relationship for historic records, and not only anything that's digitized or scanned, but a lot of our digital records that have been what we call in the archives were born digital, so they never even see paper. And what are we doing, and what are some of our best practices for that? They also looked to see if we had any risk management plans or disaster preparedness plans for the archives, and we do not. And also they looked at our records management and the records retention policy, in which we are still working on having a new policy. And one of those is the archives program could be a real great asset and benefit to helping with training and implementation and helping with field staff getting to know their records a little bit better. And that's it for this report. I think there was the idea that the recommendations and best practices that are listed in the report that Waverly and Robin recommends, that that the staff would like to make an assessment and review the report further, and possibly conduct some field feasibility studies and or talk about the feasibility of some of the recommendations. And that's probably looking at what it could be short-term, mid-term, or long-term. And then, of course, looking at what a budget could be for working on some of those recommendations. And that's the end of my presentation slideshow. And I'd like to open up for questions, and Waverly and Robin are also here to answer questions.
Okay, well, thank you, Brenda. I see you have redwood in back of you.
Yes, it's the Redwood Bowl, the 1936 grand opening dedication. I didn't know, I was looking for like a really great image for a background. I was like, oh, I have to have that one. So.
Yes, well, I went and I looked at where that is now, years later, and it looks quite a bit different now.
It sure does, yeah.
Very different. All right, so I think each of the board members did receive this report, which was fairly long, but they're, it was executive summaries. Thank you. And I just want to compliment Public Affairs for pursuing this. And I know board contingency helped pay for it or pay for the whole thing. And I do want to say that I feel like the board is on board in feeling that it's important for us to keep track of certainly the district records, and then tackling our cultural resources has always been quite a bit behind our natural resources, shall I say. So I'm really pleased to have had a chance to take a look at that report. But let me turn to the other committee members before I ask a couple of questions. So Elizabeth, Colin, you have some comments or questions for Brenda or for our consultants?
Okay, I'll go.
Okay.
Just looking at Elizabeth. Just quickly, so I understand what's happening here. You've decided that the recommendations and budgets associated with them are something to come down the line that we'll not intended to get into today.
Yes, for the staff, our staff has just now received this report and just now reviewing it. So I think that we want to have some time to prepare our response to the recommendations.
Okay.
Okay. All right.
Appreciate the background, the information. My support for this program is unending, so I won't take a lot of time on that.
Yeah, thank you, Brenda, for both for the written report and your presentation today. Very, very helpful, and really appreciate the work you're doing. I agree with Director Lane's comment that we don't put nearly as much focus on the cultural resources, and so I'm glad you're doing this work and are able to at least develop a beachhead in terms of what needs to be done in preserving and retaining those records and artifacts and photos and everything else, because I think that is, you know, to be able to have that in some way that's not only properly stored, but is also can be useful and displayed, I think it's important. I mean, it'd be a shame for this to be lost or you know, never surfaced. So thank you very much for your work on this.
Yeah, you know, I've kind of kept an eye on it over the years, and I've been pretty, I'd say I've been pretty unassertive about it, and really known, you know, that especially when we acquire new properties, the approach has been, certainly when I first came on the board, was like, well, so we don't really need to keep that, so we'll take the barn down. And true of some of the other built environment as well. But over the years, we have improved. You know, when we do buy property, hi Teresa, we get an evaluation which is now both natural and cultural, addresses both natural and cultural elements, and it used to be only the natural ones. So I really felt like that was quite a big step. And we have some procedures in place now before buildings are just taken down in the field, shall we say. I appreciate your report today, Brenda, and then, you know, having seen what happened at Big Basin, I think that just makes all of us sick. I mean, that fabulous building, and then to realize that that's where they kept their archives. And I've seen some fires adjacent to Yosemite as well, where people have had invaluable Yosemite history, and then they've been, the place is burned. So I think we're all thinking more about fire than we have in the past. The other thing that I think about is, well, you know, when Dave gave us the report on red-legged frogs, and he has been quite a phenomenal biologist, willing to set up and fold in volunteers. And that it's not something that everybody, you know, certainly every scientist is comfortable doing, and probably not every professional archivist. But as we look at the population we have out there, that people support our parks, I think that there are many things that could be done where volunteers would help us. And I'm in particular thinking about the Burrell site that we have. It will be a 10-acre site ultimately, and it has items that Beverly Ortiz rescued from the house and from the barns. And some of those things are stored at Trudeau, but others of those things were boxed up with, you know, with a tape across them, with a nice sturdy tape. And last year we went in and the tape had shriveled up because it was so hot in the barn. And at that point, Bev said she really would like to have those boxes move into the house. But she was coming to the end of her term. And as it happens, I had somebody walk in to where I was a couple days ago and said, so what's going on with the Burrell property? And I said, well, Park District owns it and we are beginning our planning on it. We've mucked out things. There's a question about what should be saved and what should be tossed. And they went over what should be saved generally and what should be tossed. And he said, you know, I would love to help volunteer on that. And I have other people who would volunteer. And I'm sitting here thinking, that it was 111 in Danville this week. And we had a group of volunteers who, with direction, would have carried those boxes out of the barn and put them into the house. So I can't help but think that there are, I know there are probably opportunities like that throughout the entire district, but it takes people to organize it, to have an intention, and to have a place to put things. And we simply have not had managers to train and enlist that kind of support. And I think that support is definitely out there. So I did want to just mention that, since I can go on forever. Since we have both Robin and Waverly here, though, I'm looked at just, if we look just at the overarching issues that you mentioned in your report, you know, those were on page 1. I wonder if you would just say a few words about those. One was lack of resources. The other was isolated identities in the silos in the parks. And the third was people having a hard time recognizing cultural resources as significant within a park setting.
I'm going to start and Robin will finish, but I just wanted to say that we think the parks are fabulous. We think the parks are amazing. We think the parks are just a gift to, and a hard-earned gift to the people of both counties. I'm glad that you all recognize how important you are and the work you do is. And, you know, we felt that it was important that the legacy of the park did not become extinct. And we wanted to help ensure that that legacy is there to protect and to preserve. And part of that is working to make sure it's comes into a place where it's safe and accessible, that for that material to be of use within the park, people have to be able to find what's in those boxes and within those cabinets. And collecting it and storing it are part of it, but the accessibility, sorry.
Mine does too, yeah.
The partner in the firm who just woke up lunchtime. And also that the recognition that cultural recreation has become a bigger and bigger part of people's lives, that many people, for various reasons, don't do natural recreation as much, but do cultural recreation, and that the cultural legacy is as important in many ways and needs to be preserved too. So I just wanted to put in that piece of it. I remember giving a talk many years ago, and the picture behind Brenda and then Bev's comments on what it looks like today was a talk I gave to the Association of Interpreters. And the title of it was, Is Nature Cultural? Is Culture Natural? And it was very much intended to talk about parks and people's understanding of the natural habitat isn't always as natural as it may appear now, and the other way around. And that's an important thing to keep it, that we had in our minds as well.
Thank you. Again, I want to echo Brenda and echo Waverly in terms of seeing how wonderful the district is. And I think, you know, our report really speaks to, I think, the fabulous story that's there in the district. We got the opportunity to visit so many sites and talk to so many wonderful people who are working so very hard to care for the natural world as well as the history and culture of the two counties. And what I want to say is that we really had the opportunity to, a rare opportunity to look at the district as a whole and to think from the perspective of how can the cultural resources be managed and integrated well into the work of the entire district, you know, in a sense. And so our our report is kind of a bird's eye view as well as a groundhog view in a sense, because we're both thinking very big, but also very much grounded in data from what we found. There are incredible opportunities there to be able to both take care of the cultural resources as well as make them work for the entire district. And there's just so much work that needs to be done to care for the parks, and everything that we again have tried to both identify and then speak to possible ways in which the district can both manage these things as well as use them strategically comes from this idea that there's just so much work to do. And if one can get the right people, as Bev has just mentioned, get the right sort of managers that are there to be, like Brenda, to be there to direct and organize and think again broadly across the district, you can begin to really leverage these resources for the district and then for the citizens that you're serving.
And I have one more thing. You had talked about the silo, the question about that. And we really were trying to think district-wide, and I visualized it in the map where the different parks are, and they're trying to make the corridors between parks. That part of what the archives does is create a cultural or historical corridor between parks. And from my running the environmental design archives, we had the records of Henry Myers and Mildred Myers, and Mildred was one of the sisters who donated the park.
Garen,
right.
Dry Creek.
And, yeah, and the blueprints for that house were in the Myers papers. And I had the opportunity to meet Jeanette Myers a long time in the 70s, I guess. No, I guess it was the early 80s. But the Myers, both Henry and his daughter Mildred, Henry was an architect, Mildred was too, they built the sanitarium that is now part of the park. And most of that building has been torn down, but the stairs are there and the powerhouse is there. And those are the same people who were at Garen, and nobody seemed to know that. And they also had drawings of the Sunol water temple and the alley leading up to the water temple in Sunol in the Myers collection. And somehow those those parks have a link, have that corridor between them that somehow disappears when those parks are seen as individual entities in a cultural and historical way. So we kind of wanted to keep those things in mind as we were going, as doing this. And it in no way undermines all the work that people does, but people do, but there's always more to do than the resources allow. And so how to manage what is there in a way that is feasible for everybody and benefits the district. So I just wanted to.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. I think we're just getting started on this. Clearly.
We're here, we're around.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing that I want to say about volunteers is that sometimes, often they're kind of connected to a location. So Brenda's having that regular Wednesday volunteers. I think they really, it's crowded, but they like to come to Trudeau, right? And for Tracy Parent, who set up quite a volunteer group at Black Diamond, they like to come to Black Diamond and work on it. And so that's something that whoever begins organizing this is going to have to take into account, because it is a large district. And when we talk about storage for archives and objects, we've been looking at the Concord Naval Weapons Station I mean, our 2,000 acre park has some really substantial buildings. And if they're like any of these other really substantial, military buildings, actually, they do have they are often not humid and they keep their temperature, So you already have a shell that could be retrofitted for all kinds of objects for sure, if you kept track of them. But then again, they're all in Concord. And if your volunteers want to be in Oakland, it's a challenge. There's no doubt about it. But I'm glad Brenda is now our archives program manager, and I'm sure she's up to the challenge. She's not losing any sleep at night, right, Brenda? Yeah, I'm sure you're not.
And that was our first recommendation. So, that's a win-win.
Yeah, you did pretty well on that.
1 down, 40 to go or something. Yeah.
Yes, well, I had a chance. I had a chance to see the report on Friday, and I think Colin and Elizabeth really didn't have that much time to look at it. There are a lot of things that that would need thought and would need to be included in a budget. But I am really pleased that we've had a chance to go over this with two experts with the ability to bring an organization and suggestions to us to consider. So Waverly and Robin, thank you once again for that.
And thank you for asking us. We were happy that when the request was a survey, but also to provide a swapped part of that. Once we'd done the survey, that we were asked to provide a what is strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats with the information that we had gathered. That was part of what we were asked to do, and that's why the report's so big. Both of those were big challenges.
Yeah,
we enjoyed it.
Okay, well, I'm glad. Yeah. And my Cleo does that all the time. Yeah. It's like a 2-year-old. If you're, if you're on the phone.
Yeah. Dexter wants to be in the middle of it.
Okay, thank you. Carol, you have your hand up.
Yes, I just want to acknowledge that, yes, it was quite a robust report. It has a lot of great recommendations. And one of the reasons that also we want to wait and review it and look at it from a budgetary standpoint is so that we can have the opportunity to include and value the comments and interests of our cultural resources coordinator, who we don't have on staff yet. That position, as you know, just got transferred over to the planning department. So we would, because we see it as a partnership between the position that Brenda holds and the cultural services representative as well. So we would like to bring it back. So Christina Kelchner and I will come together and come up with some dates that or some opportunities to share more of the report and the budgetary analysis that both the cultural resources coordinator and Brenda can do together. We thought that it was important to have the voice of that position incumbent heard.
Super.
Okay, so Colin and Elizabeth, do you have anything else you want to add right now? Okay, this was information for us, and we work to have natural and cultural resources have presentations. I think we could have all natural resources naturally in this committee, and so to have cultural resource report as in our regular meetings is really very important. Okay, so do we have any public who would like to respond and comment on this item? Boca?
A comment.
There are no public comments.
Okay, there's no further comments? Okay. All right, thank you. Okay, and thank you, Carol. No, you can proceed. Whatever direction that takes us. All right, so then our next item is to see if there is anyone who would like to comment on items not on the agenda. Coca, do we have someone interested in making a general comment to our committee?
No, there was no general comments.
All right, and we didn't receive anything in an email or voicemail for us.
There was no email, voicemail, or Zoom comments today.
Okay, thank you very much. Then next we come to board comments, and then I think also Christina has some comments for us. Colin, Elizabeth, is there anything you would like to suggest for future meetings or make any general comments?
A general comment, we at some point last year, I believe in my time frame of things kind of gets blurred these days. So I'm not exactly sure when we did it, but Bev, I think we spent some time last year on making a topics list.
Yes.
And I know I actually put some thought into it, and that hasn't come back to us in the sense of having to have a list of topics to look at and prioritize and think about. And I think it would be helpful if we did that exercise again.
Okay. Thank you. All right, Elizabeth, do you have anything else you want to add?
Well, yeah, I agree that does sound like a useful exercise, and I'd also like to see what the topics were that you'd come up with last time, and whether or not you've covered them, and whether there's still some that we want to address. That would be helpful as well.
Okay, thank you. All right, Christina, you had some comments.
Director Lane, we do have a topics list to share with you today. So I'm going to put that up on the screen. Excuse me.
My, that's responsive.
Yes. We did hear you, and had hoped to get this to you before the meeting, but lots going on out there in our parks these days. So, but this is our list. We did first want to remind the board that we will be doing a stewardship seminar this year. It will be all virtual, so over Zoom. I think the date we're looking at is November 11th, but we need to confirm that with each of you, make sure that works for you, and we'll circle back with you on that date. And then staff had recommended these 3 topics listed here: wildfire impact assessment and recovery, which is of course a new and timely topic, and then blue-green algae that we'd like to give you an update on. And then if we wanted to bring back the archives item that we just had for further discussion, we recommend that as well. And December is the next regularly scheduled meeting of this committee because we have stewardship seminar in November. And then the suggested future topic shown below is the list that I believe, Colin, that you had supplied and that we had discussed it sometime in the past. And then I had just one other slide of just to mention some of the key topics that we had done this year. Obviously, the first 2 are what we just did today. And then we did do a Spartina update, and then the IPM annual report as well. So I'll go back to the other list. And I'm happy to take any input on priorities or topics that you think might be missing from this list. I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Okay, yeah, Colin, do you have some comments? It's
sure. I would suggest that Christina, someone or Matt go back to some notes from last year, because I certainly have mine some more, and I will do so too. But there were topics that aren't showing up here that we threw out as useful. I know one on my list that was fairly high on my list was the, I guess maybe this comes under research and partnership projects. I was really interested in the various associations and connections the Park District had with the area universities and colleges and intern projects and such. So maybe that's where it falls in. The partnerships with Native peoples, I remember the topic coming up of Native American cultural studies that we'd undertaken on a district-wide basis as opposed to individual parks and their own connections with the tribes that had some connection, historic connection with individual parks. So maybe that's district-wide update on partnerships. I don't know so much about partnerships, although that's part of it. It's a component of the overall program that Bev Ortiz had pursued and established with regard to the cultural approach, historic approach the district as a whole just took toward its Native American heritage. So I guess two of the topics are sort of there from my my memory, but it would help maybe if we looked at our notes from last year's sessions to make sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Coffey. Yes, the update on research and partnership projects is exactly what we intended, is a focus on the universities in the area and the work that we may be doing with those. And district-wide update, I think what I hear you saying is partnerships, yes, but also any studies or information, research that we have on the Native communities in the district-wide.
Yeah, my understanding is Bev really had that as a program. Of course, it resulted in that fabulous educational brochure that proved so popular with teachers and just people that were passing by and saw them when we were doing ambassador programs. So in any event, that brochure was a result of a program that Bev undertook, and I'd like to get a sense for that program and where it is now.
Sure, and I think that in part that will be, once we are able to fill Bev Ortiz's position, that will come under that position. And so that may be something we need to bring kind of early next year as an update, once we're able to get that position filled.
That'd be great.
Okay, great.
Okay, and as I looked at that, for us to have an update on partnerships with Native peoples, one of the things that has been happening in recent months, as I think I mentioned to you, is the Devon Reef in planning has been doing a consulting with Native descendants with regard to the name for Concord Hills. And I think if I could do a little tweak on that particular one, I think it would be interesting on this committee for us to have at least a brief report from Devon on that, because we've had some mixed results. Oh, sorry. It's my cat just.
Someone's hungry, Bev.
Just got the cord here, just a minute. We've had somewhat of an uneven history of consulting with Native peoples. And this has been one that I think may have renewed some good experiences for the district and the descendants. And I think so it would be good for us to know about that. In addition, I had a suggestion from a constituent who was very impressed with what Mid-Penn had done in communicating with Native peoples on Mount Umunum. And I would like to have someone tell us more about that. That was quite an extraordinary agreement that was put together by a park that is very similar to the regional parks. So that would be my request in the future. Okay, we've got things, right? And I guess once again, what I would like to say is that I think this committee should be meeting every other month. And we've been meeting quarterly in the past, but I think every other month would be better as we think about 2021, which we are thinking about now, right? And then I guess my other comment is that I know that we are looking very seriously at the budget, and we're in the middle of it right now. And well, I actually have two positions that I think would be very important not to leave unfilled. And one, of course, is the cultural coordinator, and the other would be the interpretive and recreation manager position that Dave Zuckerman just vacated. I wouldn't like to see either of those be lost in a quest for budget austerity. Okay. So any other comments? Anything else from you, Christina? Interesting Point Melody things.
Yes, I see Director Eccles has her hand up. Director Lane.
Yeah, I wanted to underscore some of the comments that have been made about the partnerships with Native peoples and really doing more to recognize that very important piece of our cultural history here in the parks and in the country more generally. But and one of the things is, I was watching the Richmond City Council meeting last night, and Courtney Cummings, who's a Native American person, she was speaking about how there'd been so much focus and attention in the plans to the preservation of historic buildings, but really almost nothing regarding the indigenous people who had lived there and their sacred sites. And, I've been reflecting on that. And, I think that's a extremely important observation. And so I think we as the Park District as well should take that to heart in our own, in our own territories, not our territory, but in the land that we're helping to preserve and manage, and really think about that and think about, bringing forth more of the indigenous people's cultural heritage.
Okay. Well, and I would add, because I know about it, that along that shoreline of Point Melody for decades, there was a successful Chinese shrimp community.
That too, yes.
Yeah, and there is at least one decent photograph of that. And I think that's yet again, every one of our parks has those layers of narratives, which probably we would be the only agency thinking in those terms. Well, I shouldn't say only, but it's a logical thing for us as a park to think about.
That we do think about it, and we should think about it even more, I think, or do more than think about it. I guess we should.
Yeah, well,
there's more to be done, I think.
Yeah, well, and I think this report certainly made that clear. Okay. All right.
I just want to thank the board for your comments, and I know that Chief of Planning Brian Holt is on the line listening as well, and that the work that he and Devin have done with my support of reaching out to the Native American community in relationship to the Concord naming is very important, and not just that, but over the last couple of years have been working on building those relationships. And it's sometimes with the next generation of Native American representatives. We may have had relationships with folks, for a long time, but their descendants are coming along and starting to move into leadership positions. And so I know Brian and Devin have been very focused on making sure that we are in relationship and communication regularly with those leaders. And Brian and I have had this conversation for quite some time since I came, how important it is to continue to nurture those relationships. And it's a challenge because we're not just one city that has one tribe. We're 33 cities and 2 counties in a large area. And so it really does take an investment of resources to build those relationships. And it's exciting work. It's very important work, and it's work that we are committed to. So appreciate the board's interest and encouragement of that.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. Are there any other comments before I move to adjourn the meeting?
Thank you to staff for all the hard work in putting the meeting together, Coca and others. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for that. All right, we are adjourned. Goodbye.